Shalom and welcome back, friends, to Window on Mount Zion. Now we will be starting chapter 2, which is divided into 3 parts. So now we're doing part 1 on the first Sabbath, the first Shabbat on Mount Zion. We were nearing the end of the week and preparing for our first Shabbat, Sabbath, on Mount Zion. Friday morning in Israel is different from all other mornings of the week. It is marked by the increased tempo of its activities. Shopping, cleaning, cooking, all work has to be finished before the Sabbath begins at sundown. On Mount Zion, even greater speed was required to get through the tasks of the day because all work had to cease, even earlier than in the city. By noon, all the workers on Mount Zion were hurriedly completing their tasks. Doors and gates were being locked. Loitering tourists rejoined their groups and departed. Mount Zion was preparing to receive the blessing of Sabbath in silence. As the sun moved toward the western horizon, it seemed to me as if the heavens opened and poured out upon the earth showers of winged blessings. Blessings of peace, joy, rest, and thankfulness. The Sabbath blessings which flow from the Most High on the 7th day. It was as though I felt the unheard, unseen wings as they gently descended and enveloped the holy hill. An indescribable peace settled upon it, a peace created for all mankind, a blessing intended for every creature willing to receive it, a peace which the Eternal had ordained for the place of his habitation. I kindled the Sabbath lights with the prayer, Baruch atah Adonai, Melech haolam, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by thine ordinances and commanded us to keep the Sabbath day holy. That evening, as always, the 2 synagogues on Mount Zion were closed, for it was forbidden to come to the mount at night. Albert and I left the house, walked past the military post, and entered the precincts of King David's tomb, and climbed up the steps to the roof above it. From there, the old city, and particularly the temple area, could be seen. For Jews in the divided city of Jerusalem, this was the nearest point to the sacred place. The golden dome of the Mosque of Omar, Dome of the Rock, on the temple site, gleamed in the light of the setting sun. It dominated the old city with its imposing size and grandeur, as though conscious of the sacredness of the rock it covered. The rock on which, according to tradition, Abraham had been prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac in obedience to God's command, and thereby laid the foundation of our faith with the promise that, in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. On the wall of the old city nearest to Mount Zion, the sandbags of a Jordanian military post could be seen. Beyond the city, the Mount of Olives provided a background to the Golden Dome, rising above it to where the tall, slim spire of the Russian church stood like an arrow pointing heavenwards. In a corner of the balustraded roof where we were, a slim bearded man in a long coat and wide-brimmed black hat was silently praying. He turned and greeted us, inviting Albert to join him. He explained in a gentle voice that he was a rabbi who lived quite a distance away and came every Sabbath Eve to this roof to pray facing the temple site. His name was Uri. Very soon, Yaakov, our first visitor to Ha'ohel, appeared, and with him a man and his 2 young sons. This little group had been coming regularly to the roof for Sabbath prayers. I joined them. Flanking this roof was the tower of the Domitian Church, where our soldiers were on constant guard behind the sandbagged arches. On the roof of a small Franciscan church just below us, two priests strolled back and forth in silent meditation. The soldiers, attracted by our voices, watched respectfully. Some prayed with us without leaving their post. Shadows of evening softened the gleam of the golden dome and enveloped the old city. Before our prayers had ended, the voice of the muezzin was calling his Muslim brethren to prayer, and church bells pealed out the hour of the Christian service. Jerusalem, the center of the world's main spiritual streams, was not only divided by military borders. I was convinced that one day the military barriers would be removed, and I believe that the spiritual barriers will also fall. Our companions on the roof returned with us to Ha'ohel. After reciting Kiddush, the blessing on the wine, and joyously singing a Sabbath song, they hurriedly departed. We were the only ones then allowed to remain on Mount Zion after dark. Early the next morning, the silence in Garden Square was filled with the blessings of Sabbath joy and peace. The day was different, even for the pigeons. They had no need to wait for their food this morning, and were leisurely enjoying the remains of the double portion of food left for them by Ovadia on Friday. In the little Sephardic synagogue next to King David's tomb, the worshippers arrived early. Their unrestrained Sabbath joy could be felt as their voices mingled in songs of prayer and thanksgiving. The small congregation of the Ashkenazi synagogue, above the chamber of destruction, gathered a little later. Albert joined this handful of simple, devoted men who so strongly felt the holiness of Mount Zion in their hearts that they had walked great distances to satisfy their longing to worship on this holy hill. A few women also came to pray here on the Sabbath. As I joined them in prayer, I was always deeply conscious that the atmosphere in this austere little synagogue, reclaimed from the ruins of Mount Zion, was imbued with a profounder measure of faith and devotion than I had found anywhere else. At the end of the service, in an anteroom, they pronounced the blessing on the wine and drank it with joy. Singing and dancing, the men concluded their Sabbath morning in the synagogue. At dusk, Albert walked to the top of the Mount Zion steps and returned a little later with a very young soldier. The Sabbath day was nearly ended. I looked questioningly at Albert. Who is this? This is Yehuda, Albert introduced him. He is one of our neighbors from the military post and would like to share Havdalah with us. The wine, candles, and spice had already been prepared on the table for the Havdalah service. The ceremony which terminates the Sabbath and marks the beginning of the new week. Yehuda's eyes lit up. It is like being at home with my parents, he said. I lighted the Havdalah candle, which you can see here. It's one candle that's woven with 6 strands. The 6 strands symbolizing the 6 days of the week ahead. And Havdalah separates the holiness of Shabbat from the week, the regular work week ahead. And the candle symbolizes carrying that light of Shabbat into the week ahead. The cup of wine was filled to overflowing, and there were the sweet scented spices. All spoke of health, happiness, and blessing in the coming week. Albert read the prayer of thanksgiving for the distinction between light and darkness, between the holy and the mundane. Then he recited the concluding prayer. Behold, God is my salvation. Him will I trust and not be afraid. For my strength and song is the Eternal, and He hath been my sustenance. Thus the Shabbat ended, and we wished each other Shavua Tov. Have a good week. With the end of the Sabbath, When the blessing of that day seems to linger on to welcome in the new week, a small band of Orthodox worshippers assemble in the little Sephardic synagogue adjoining King David's tomb, where with song and dance they give praise and thanks for another week. As I watched, teenage boys with their well-curled side locks falling beneath their wide-brimmed black hats accompanied their elder brothers and fathers, all carrying an assortment of bags filled with food and drink. Plates and glasses were set out on a long table, and herrings, bread, nuts, cake, and fruit were unpacked. Some of the men were sitting reading prayers on benches facing the ark containing the scrolls of the Torah. The boys were in loud conversation nearby. We were transported to another world as we observed the scene through a small open door. Soon the benches around the table were occupied. A long-bearded rabbi wearing a large fur-brimmed hat and a golden black striped kaftan sat at the head of the table. He broke off a piece of bread, said the appropriate blessing, and then the meal began. The light from the old lamp hanging from the ceiling seemed to diffuse its glow in a special way on this assembly of men, old and young, gathered around the table in this little synagogue, with its scrolls of the Torah hidden behind the red velvet curtains on which the Star of David was embroidered in gold. After they finished eating and had cleared up, a space was made for dancing, for these Hasidic Jews believe in expressing their religious fervor in joyous dancing and singing. A few onlookers had joined us outside the synagogue, other religious Jews, and curious visitors from other lands. When those inside noticed us, we were warmly invited to join the dancers. The men among us were led into the synagogue itself, and the women into a side room where we could watch. With harmonium and drum as accompaniment, the singing and dancing soon began. All joined hands and danced in circles. Unrestrained joy filled the little synagogue. Rabbis and their children took the hands of their visitors, Jews or Christians, Englishmen or German alike, and together they danced and sang, united in praise and thanksgiving. The light of Zion shone more brightly. Our new neighbors. It was not long after we had come to live on Mount Zion that the sounds of workmen could be heard again from within the thick stone walls of the ruined building behind our house. David Palumbo, the sculptor, had received permission to restore this building as a place in which to work and exhibit his sculpture. After many months of tireless effort, he transformed this old ruin with its arched ceilings and thick pillars of stone into a most fitting setting for his work. Here you can see the Palumbo Gallery, which is still there, although the Palumbos are no longer with us, but you can see the door that he crafted from metal, and he was also commissioned to construct the huge iron gates outside Mount Herzl Cemetery, which are still there to this day. Now in Garden Square, facing the entrance to his gallery and at the corner of our house, he erected one of his sculptures which depicted wings. In his hands, the cold, hard iron took the form and grace of a vibrant wing. Now, this sculpture you can see here is beautiful, and it's very similar to the one he constructed, except his was all solid metal, and with a circular base with these beautiful wings arising from it. But this one, it was very similar and also very beautiful, so we decided to share it. But in David Palumbo's hands, the cold, hard iron took the form and grace of a vibrant wing. For me, this particular symbol of the unseen wings that I always felt to be on Mount Zion, especially in times of difficulty and danger, were captured in the sculpture. David Palumbo and his young Chilean-born wife, Yona, became our neighbors only during the day, and at night we were still alone. However, new life was coming to Mount Zion. The military authorities had decided to strengthen the border guard, and a group of 10 young men on military service was sent to Mount Zion. They were members of Nachal, a unique branch of the Israeli army, whose young men and women spent part of their military service farming by day and doing guard duty by night. Most Nachal soldiers served on the borders, where they established agricultural villages. On Mount Zion, this was different. The Nachal boys here did guard duty and worked as printers. It was in effect an urban Nachal outpost, and since this was Mount Zion, all the boys were from a religious school. They repaired a house that stood right on the border and used it as their living quarters, and installed a small printing press in a room in a nearby building where they printed religious literature. On the Sabbath eve, these religious Nachal soldiers helped to make a minyan, the congregation of 10 men required for service in Jewish law. They gathered on the roof above King David's tomb, and Ha-Ohel became their second home. The first alarm. It was the end of the summer when the land of Israel, bathed in the sun for long months under a cloudless blue canopy, lies burnt and sere, crying out for water to quench its thirst. With the onset of the winter rains, all nature seems to echo King David's psalm. Sing unto the Lord with thanksgiving, sing praise upon the harp unto our God, who covereth the heavens with clouds, who prepareth rain for the earth. Work in the garden had to be suspended for the time. The tourist season was over, and few people came to Mount Zion. With the shortening days and the frequent storms of lashing wind and heavy rain, this danger zone held little attraction for the visitor. Only the very pious came to pray, among them Isaac and his wife Bilhah, for whom Mount Zion was the place nearest to God. They spent many days living with us while their new home was being built in Jerusalem. It was while they were staying with us that we had an unexpected call to go to Tel Aviv. We left Mount Zion on the Wednesday, intending to be back in good time for the Sabbath, but we were unavoidably detained until very early on Sunday morning. There was a strange silence as we lowered and relocked the barrier across the road up to Mount Zion. And as Garden Square came into view, we saw that it was filled with groups of unfamiliar soldiers, guns, and other military vehicles, which blocked the access to our house. The soldiers, equally surprised at our appearance, asked, "How did you get here? Don't you know that it is dangerous and nobody is being allowed up here today?" Involved in family affairs and with the Sabbath intervening, we had heard no news since Friday. We were now told that on Friday morning, 3 of our soldiers on border patrol had been fired on by the Jordanians. An exchange of mortar and gunfire had lasted for some hours. Our military post on Mount Zion had been slightly damaged, and bullets had reached into the city, but there had been no casualties. The soldiers were emphatic. "You cannot stay here." "We live here," we explained to them, "and have just returned from Tel Aviv. We knew nothing of what has been happening. But even if we had known, we would still have come back." As we entered the house, we found Isaac and Bilhah waiting with suitcases packed, their faces anxious. "We're leaving," Isaac said. "We can't stay here another day. We wanted to leave earlier, but waited for your return. In any case, we were afraid to go out on the road yesterday." "It was terrible," said Bilhah. "The house shook with the vibration of the big guns. The noise was deafening." She trembled at the memory of it. "When did all this happen?" I asked. "Early Friday morning." "But it was all quiet after that, wasn't it?" "Yes," said Isaac. but we were afraid it would start again any moment. In fact, Bilhah was terrified. "Where did you kindle the Sabbath lights?" I asked. "Oh, we were too afraid. We just sat in the corner under the stairs all the time until this morning." "Where will you go?" I asked as they prepared to leave. "To Isaac's sister in Tel Aviv. It will be safer there," replied Bilhah. As we began to arrange the day in this unexpected atmosphere, 2 of the young Nachal boys came to see us, accompanied by the commander of one of the new units posted on Mount Zion. "The situation here is rather serious," said the commander, "and we do not like to have civilians around. We expect more trouble during the night or early morning, and we advise you to go into the town and stay there until things have quietened down." "We would rather stay here," I replied, and Albert agreed. "But don't you realize the dangers?" he asked in surprise. "We are always in danger," I replied. "After all, there are dangers everywhere, and if this is our place, we do not like to leave it in times of danger. Perhaps we can be of some use if there is trouble, even if only to give you some coffee while you are waiting." He smiled and walked away, shaking his head in disbelief. Later, one of our Nachal boys came to me looking very troubled. "What is it, Ephraim?" I asked. With heartfelt concern he pleaded with me. "I feel about you as I would about my mother if she were here," he said. "Please don't stay here tonight. I'll worry about you so much if the shooting starts again." I was deeply moved by his concern and even considered leaving for his sake. "But if your mother were here, Ephraim," I said, "I don't think she'd want to leave you if you were in danger. She'd surely prefer to stay near you." Ephraim shook his head and, after a moment of thoughtful silence, said, "Good, so I'll tell my commander." A short time later, the commanding officer returned. "We have decided to let you stay," he said, "but you mustn't go upstairs to your bedroom. Remain downstairs in the corner under the stairs. That's the safest place in this house. We may have to put a couple of soldiers upstairs in the loft." We agreed to do as he ordered. Nothing happened that night or the next day, and after a few days the anxiety was over. Garden Square was again clear of troops and equipment, and life returned to normal. But the shadow of danger was always there, chilling and disquieting, even on the warmest and most peaceful of days. That is the end of part 1 of chapter 2. So we invite you to come back and join us again for chapter 2, part 2, which will be telling about the first Hanukkah in the Rose's house on Mount Zion.